Hey guys, I'm John. Welcome back to my channel. In this video, I'm continuing part 2 of my series where I just read The Value of Freedom, which is the document published by the Alberta Prosperity Project, sort of the manifesto for Alberta independence. And I give a little bit of commentary, whatever just happens to come out of my brain. But the purpose of this video series is I want to better educate myself about Alberta independence. This is the biggest issue that we Albertans are facing. We have to do our homework on this. We have to enter into this with like as much due diligence as we possibly can. So I realize that probably most people haven't read this document, even though it's being widely shared across social media. And it says right there in the title, it's open for public discussion. So from now until the referendum, we need to start getting ourselves educated so that we can best defend Alberta independence and just be intellectually honest about it. So one of the goals that I'm going to do here in this video is push back as best as I possibly can against this document, anticipating, things that people might say to criticize it. So I left off, I read this whole part here. So go check out part 1 if you're interested in that. And starting off with part 2 is going to be revenue available to an independent Alberta using historical data. This document outlines the revenue available to an independent Alberta based on an estimated federal tax contributions from the province for 2021 to 2024. So right there, I'm kind of thinking, wouldn't it be nice if we had more of a historical snapshot? Because the last couple of years, I don't know if that's really representative of what Alberta could be. But if we start going back farther in time, then we'd have to adjust for inflation. So I think this is kind of fair to take a short little snapshot like this, but it'd be nice to have more data. Alberta is estimated to have contributed approximately $68 to $75 billion annually to the government of Canada, with only 22 to 26 billion returned in federal transfers, resulting in a net over contribution by Albertans to Canada of 44 to 47 billion dollars per year. So the whole argument here is that Alberta is contributing way more than we're getting back. And as you're going to see when we start getting into some of the numbers, it's important to understand that there is a huge difference here, because some of the expenditures that we're going to talk about are estimates. Even in the first part of this document, it says that there's a estimate, margin of error, whatever, plus or minus 10%. So, let's just be honest, right? If Alberta were independent, retaining these revenues comprising personal income tax, corporate income tax, goods and services tax, excise taxes, employment insurance, Canada pension plan, man, we pay a lot of taxes. Contributions would significantly enhance its fiscal capacity. So that's the argument. We pay more than what we get in. If we get to keep it all, then we're going to be way better off. This analysis suggests that an independent Alberta could have access to an additional $44 to $47 billion annually. $44 to $47 billion annually. So there's a talking point that people who support Alberta independence should just memorize, right? Like, we're not going to be hurting when we become independent. Enabling substantial investments in infrastructure, public services, economic diversification. Yeah, we're going to be able to do a lot with that. Estimated federal tax contributions from Alberta based on available data. Alberta's federal tax contributions for 2021 to 2024 are broken down as follows in billions of Canadian dollars. So this first column shows personal income tax. Every year we pay between 30 to 37 billion dollars. That's money directly coming off of your paycheck going to Ottawa. Okay? And then we pay another 9 to 12 billion. That's corporate income tax. So I imagine, the biggest companies, they're the ones paying most of that. So it's probably a lot of energy companies, but all the big companies, like all the corporations, they're paying that much. And then GST, 8 to say $10 billion. Excise taxes, that's like gasoline taxes, I guess. And I don't know, do they include like luxury taxes and stuff like that, like cigarette taxes and marijuana? Is that all, factored into these excise taxes? 2 to say $3 billion. EI and CPP every year between say 12.5 to $17.5 billion. Like, that's a lot. I am noticing that there's a big change here. So 2021, well, that was right around when did the pandemic start, right? So see, this is a problem with such a small snapshot, right? Is there's going to be a big spike up and down in some of these numbers, and it's hard to kind of explain, like, why did it go from 12.5 to 17.5? Like, does that mean more people are working, so they're paying into the pot? I think that's what that means. So our total contribution, like, this isn't the argument that it's making, though. It's just making that, hey, we're paying more than what we get back. So my pushback there is neither here nor there. 62 to $77 billion. That's our total contribution to Canada. Here you go, Ottawa. Let's write a check. Gone. Okay? And then Ottawa turns around and then they write back $22 to $26 billion. Great, that's coming back to us. Okay, so our net contribution is $41 to $50 billion per year. Now, it's worth reading these data sources here. So they're citing Statistics Canada, data on revenue, expenditure, and budgetary balance for general governments. And then they cite the tables that it comes from. These sources track federal revenue by province, including tax contributions like personal income tax, corporate income tax, GST, excise taxes, EI, CPP. Historical data 2011 to 2023. So did they deliberately exclude previous years and just take such a narrow snapshot? Okay, it was used to estimate Alberta's share, adjusted for 2021 to 2024 using GDP. Okay, Alberta's is about 11.6%. So I think the argument that we're making here is that Alberta is 11.6% of Canada's GDP. Am I reading that correctly? Revenue. Okay. All right. So note that various sources are not in agreement as to totals. So frequently midpoints or conservative estimates were used to ensure the case is not overstated. So, I mean, that's really important when you're making a judgment like this or a document like this, because we can't just use the best case scenario. Personally, I would feel much more comfortable even using the worst case scenario. A midpoint, kind of conservative, okay, that's good. The Fraser Institute. So, I mean, this is a conservative think tank group, right? But, all right, this is Alberta's net contribution studies. The Fraser Institute's reports 2019 to 2024 studies on Alberta's net contribution during the economic booms analyze Alberta's federal tax contributions versus transfers. Note that StatsCan 36 and whatever is also used in their estimates. So the Fraser Institute is also citing StatsCan. So, I mean, whether or not there's a bias in a particular report from the Fraser Institute, if they're using StatsCan data, that pretty much alleviates the concerns, I guess. GST numbers from the CRA, Table 5, GST, HST filters and values of GST, HST collected, input tax credits, and net tax by jurisdiction 2022 pro rata for other years. Okay. The Library of Parliament, distribution of federal revenues and expenditures, background paper October 6, 2020. Federal revenues and expenditures by province from 2011 to 2018. Okay, so that is before the time frame that we're looking at here. Baseline for Alberta's tax contributions and transfer amounts, which was extrapolated to 2021 to 2024 using inflation and economic growth data. So they made some extrapolations in what? Alberta's tax contribution and transfer amounts. So does that mean that, you tell me, because I'm kind of confused here now. Are these numbers, the personal income tax corporate, are these all extrapolations from 2011, 2020, 2018? Appears to be what it's saying. Canada Revenue Agency, CRA payroll deductions table, blah, blah, blah. Detail federal and provincial tax deductions, CPP contributions, EI premiums. While individual taxpayer data isn't province specific, was cross-referenced with the CRA's national totals and Alberta's economic output. So that's interesting. Individual taxpayer data isn't province specific. So it's kind of frustrating actually, because when I was thinking about this document, I was thinking, the government's got to have perfect data for us to work with. And this is part of probably the problem why we have so much problems in Canada. If we're not collecting good data, like politicians are making decisions off of this stuff and they just look for a little talking point here and a talking point there. And I suppose you could criticize our side of doing that too, maybe, but we're working with the best data available. OECD revenue statistics, Canada tax to GDP ratio 2024 report notes Canada tax to GDP ratio increased to 34.8% in 2023. What was it before that? Using Alberta's GDP, 15 to 17% of Canada's total GDP. Okay, so they're just using Alberta's percentage of Canada's. Okay. This supports the contribution estimates. Okay. That supports it. Okay, these are other transfers for university research, one-time municipal grants, which are within the tolerance of the numbers. Transfers back include the below as well as EICPP payments. Okay, so here's some of the transfers back. So they're just breaking it down, the different things like old age security, right? I guess because we're going to have to take over that, right? Because these things are things that we're currently relying on the federal government to transfer back to us. So presumably if we stop paying them, then we're going to have to take it over and pay it ourselves. So, okay, so key observations. Total contributions. Alberta contributed an estimated $68 to $75 billion annually to federal revenues, driven by its strong oil and gas sector. 87% of Canada's crude oil exports, 98% of natural gas with British Columbia. Okay, because I know British Columbia has a large share of it, so I wish we could know what it was without British Columbia included. And a high per capita income. Okay, so we're doing all right, I guess. Net contributions after accounting for federal transfers back, 22 to 26 billion. So that's why there's such a range here. My concerns that I'm bringing up are probably all justified, but they're swallowed up by this range because they're not saying an exact number here. They're saying it's between 22 to 26. $4 billion is a big chunk of money, and if we're willing to be off by that much and our argument still holds true that we're going to be better off, then little things here and there, even though they add up to billions, overall it's not a game changer. Alberta's over contribution to Canada was approximately 44 to 47 billion dollars per year, totaling 185 billion dollars over 4 years. Okay, that's a lot of billions. All right, revenue components. Personal income tax, so 46% of contributions, reflecting Alberta's high income. So that's money directly coming from Albertans, right there. 46% of the contributions come from you, Mr. and Mrs. Alberta taxpayer. Okay, so you are directly paying Ottawa. And then 15% boosted by oil and gas corporate profits. So that's your corporate income tax. So the corporations are paying. This was a misconception that I had because I thought that corporations contributed more to this, but personal income tax, that's a huge chunk. GST and excise taxes, 16% with excise taxes driven by fuel due to Alberta's energy sector. So that's your fuel tax. Man, we pay so many taxes. You look at the price of gas. How much? What? Leave a comment below. I don't know this, but leave a comment below. What is the percentage that we pay for fuel tax? Like, how does that even work? We just think, oh, the price of oil goes up, so then we see the gasoline prices go up. But how much of that is directly related to government taxes? Please leave a comment below and enlighten me. Fiscal implications for an independent Alberta. If Alberta were independent, it could retain a full $68 to $75 billion in annual federal tax contributions, rather than losing $44 to $47 billion net to Ottawa. This revenue would include... here's the big argument, guys. Personal income tax, $32 to $37 billion. Could fund enhanced public services such as healthcare, education, or allow tax cuts to stimulate economic growth. We'll probably do a little bit of both, because we desperately need to improve our healthcare in this province and our education system. Everything needs money. But at the same time, throwing billions of dollars at it isn't the solution. There's policy changes. We need to be much more efficient with our money. But at least in the short term, you can throw a little bit more money at something and hope that it makes an improvement, like in the transition period when we become a republic, and then a huge tax cut. And I think the naysayers to this, they're like, oh yeah, Alberta's going to be screwed as soon as we leave Canada. Well, look, businesses go wherever the taxes are the lowest. And if Alberta's taxes in the developed world are the most competitive, if we have the lowest or close to the lowest, we're going to start seeing international companies coming here. They're going to be lining up at the door. We're going to be turning them away. If we can cut taxes, it's a bit counterintuitive, but this was actually proven in the last time when Trump when he became president. He cut all the taxes, and then the revenue actually went up for the United States. And people are like, oh, you cut taxes and the revenue goes up. Well, yeah, if more businesses come. And so that's kind of the big, thing here. That was personal, right? But now here's the corporate taxes, right? $10 to $11 billion. Retention of corporate taxes, particularly from the energy sector, could support reinvestment in infrastructure or renewable energy diversification. Wait, what? I'm not sold on this renewables. I think nuclear, cold fusion if we ever get it. But right now, oil and gas is the best bet. And I don't want to see more farmland getting paved over by solar panels. Driving from Stettler to Red Deer, you can see all those solar panels out there by Joffrey, for example. That's not the solution. How long do those things last for, and how much energy do they produce, and what does it do to the soil? There's so many other concerns. But anyway, GST, $9 billion, a consumption-based tax that could be maintained or adjusted due to balance revenue needs and economic competitiveness. So, in the first episode, he was talking about a 5% Alberta sales tax. So I think that is definitely on the table here in this document. We'll see how that goes over with Albertans. Excise taxes, $2.8 billion, significant fuel tax revenue could fund transportation or environmental initiatives. I wonder if the people writing this are actually sold on this environmental stuff, because it keeps coming up again and again. I'm actually surprised if this is something ideological that they buy into, or if this is just maybe pandering to people in the middle or even on the left of this issue. Try to bring them into the fold, say, hey, look, we can still pay for a bunch of environmental stuff. And in my first video, I made the point that we need to take responsibility for the things that we can actually control. And so we don't need to worry about what China and India are doing to the environment. And even though it does affect us, we just need to take responsibility for here. So I am in favor of initiatives to lower our carbon footprint, and to especially more things like soil and water. We need to be responsible stewards of the environment. And I think like every Albertan can agree with that statement. Like we need to be responsible for the things we can take control of. I suppose there's some that don't. EI and CPP, $15 to $17 billion, establishing an Alberta pension plan and employment insurance system could redirect these funds to benefit Albertans directly, potentially with lower contribution rates due to the province's favorable demographics. So that is another big argument, is that we have a younger population, and so, they tend to work harder and pay more taxes, I guess. So especially when it comes to a pension, if you want to have more people paying in than taking out, right? So a younger population is better for a pension, where other places that have older populations, they have more people taking out than putting in. So that's another strong argument. That's also just in favor of Alberta getting its own pension plan, which, come on, we should have done this already. All right, economic and policy benefits. Retaining the full-scale tax and payments of $68 to $75 billion annually would transform Alberta's fiscal landscape. Infrastructure investment funds could address aging infrastructure, roads, pipelines, public transit, enhancing economic efficiency. Yes. Public services. Increased revenue could improve healthcare, education, social programs, reducing wait times, enhancing quality of life. Yes. Economic diversification, investing in technology, renewables, and other sectors could reduce reliance on oil and gas, mitigating volatility risks. That to me is the big one, because like Alberta is extremely at risk of the fluctuations, as we've seen. Like now that there's a massive spike in the price of oil because of the war in Iran, Alberta might actually be able to balance its budget this year. And then debt reductions. Alberta provincial debt, $78.4 billion in 2023, could be addressed more rapidly, freeing up future budgets. So conclusion, an independent Alberta could retain an estimated $68 to $75 billion in annual federal tax revenues, with a net gain of $44 to $47 billion after accounting for current federal transfers. This substantial fiscal capacity would enable substantial tax reductions, while transformative investments in infrastructure, public services, and economic diversification, positioning Alberta as a robust, self-sustaining economy. While challenges such as establishing new administrative systems and securing trade agreements exist, the financial case for independence is compelling, with the potential to significantly enhance Alberta's economic and social prosperity. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. What do you think? I mean, if you can't argue with this part here. I guess you could say these are projections, right? My dog's barking. I think you can say these are reasonable. Hey, I record live. Ricky's not at the park. These are reasonable, but it seems like they're projections. So. Okay, sorry about that, guys. These are reasonable, but yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Okay, so next I want to get into the costs, and this is where I think there's a lot more room for debate, because yeah, the revenues seem pretty cut and dry. Like, we're sending this much, it's easy to calculate. Even if the projections are off by a couple billion, we're still like way in the positive for this. So estimated costs for replacement of federal services in an independent Alberta. Challenges and considerations. Loss of federal services. So right there, these are the big concerns. Okay, independence would require Alberta to fund services currently provided by Ottawa. Example, defense, international relations, potentially offsetting some revenue gains. Yeah. And some of these expenses might actually be greater if we have to pay for them just as part, a smaller group of people paying for essentially the same service, like an embassy in another country. So, okay. Economic transition. Establishing independent tax systems and programs like an Alberta pension plan would require significant upfront costs and administrative restructuring. Okay, reasonable. Trade and market access. Independence could impact trade agreements requiring negotiations to maintain access to Canadian and international markets. Like, I'm really happy that they're pointing out these main concerns, because I keep hearing this on social media. Basically, these three arguments coming up again and again. So it's like, just get it out there in the open. This is a reality. The risks are real, right? But there's also risks to staying in Canada. But that's another topic. Below is a summary of the key services currently provided by Canadian federal government that an independent Alberta would need to create or enhance, along with estimated annual costs and initial setup costs for each service. The estimates are based on Alberta's economic share, 11.6% of the population, about 14% of federal revenue. So what that means is they are taking the total, I think, of the Canadian budget for these various items that you see below, and then they're just taking out a chunk of it and saying, okay, well, here's the total cost of this thing. Alberta is 11.6% of the population, and we are 14% of the federal revenue. So, factor that down or scale that down, and then this is how much our costs would be. So that sounds reasonable, but I wish there was a better way to calculate this. I don't know how else I would calculate these expenses. Leave a comment below if you think there's a better way to calculate these. It should be noted that where desirable, federal employees who transition to service within an independent Alberta would certainly seek to preserve their earned pensions. Fair. Which would be a point of negotiation with Canada, backstopped by guarantees by Alberta. So yeah, like, cooler heads are going to prevail here. We're not going to just fire all the federal employees. They're going to have jobs here in Alberta, and we're going to negotiate, but like, we're going to negotiate to preserve their pensions. Okay. Estimated costs for federal services in an independent Alberta. So here it lists off some of the big items, right? And then how many billions it costs. And now this initial setup cost, I don't know how they figured this out. All right, let me read down here. Initial setup cost, $2.8 billion to $5.7 billion for infrastructure, administrative systems requiring new funds, or debt financing, as these are one-time expenses not covered by current provincial budgets. Initial capital funds primarily needed for capital investments, defense equipment, embassies, and expanded services. Indigenous services increased 2.4 to $3.2 billion. These could be funded by reallocating the $44 to $47 billion over contributions. So, look, this is, I think, another fair criticism. I don't know if you've ever had a time in your life when you've just received a bunch of money for something. Like, somebody passed away and just gave you a big chunk of money, or you won the lottery or something, and now you got a big pile of money, right? And then your solution is, well, I'll just pay for this, I'll just pay for that, I'll just pay for this, I'll just pay for that, and pretty soon it's all gone. That's kind of the temptation that I think a lot of people have when they hear this big number, 44 to 47 billion. Like, yeah, we'll be able to do everything, right? But it's good to know that here they're actually breaking it down in like reasonable estimates, based off our population and our contribution. These are what the expenses could be, and here's what the costs might be. Indigenous services increased to $4.2 to $5 billion annually, $1.2 to $1.28 billion base, plus $2.4 to $3.2 billion in new funding to support the transition to sovereign. So, I don't know, why is it costing that much? What's the rationale here, right? And then for a point of reference, the vast majority of services encountered by Albertans are already provided by the government within the province, many of which would be well privatized with proper oversight and regulation by the government. So I'm going to go back up to that table here in a second, but here's things that Alberta already pays for. Okay? I don't know if you knew this, but education, healthcare, all of these things, social services, these are all our courts. They're already funded by Alberta. We're not relying, at least to any significant degree, on the federal government for these things. And we could have added a lot more to these. We could have added policing, and we could have added a pension and EI. We could have added all that. I wish Alberta would have done that 10 years ago. The best time to do it was a long time ago. Second best time is right now. And the third best time is going to be when we have an independent republic. And then here's all the things that municipalities already pay for. Streets and sidewalks, public transportation, urban land use, fire, okay, wastewater. So rest assured, those things aren't even affected by this. All right, now here's the things that we're kind of estimating are the expenses. So national defense, $3 to $5 billion. I personally think that this number is probably one of the biggest ones we could wiggle around. I mean, I would like to see an independent Republic of Alberta buy at least 50 F-45s. And I said F-45. Those are the ones being developed. So we'll just jump right over the F-35s that we were supposed to take possession of, but our government's been screwing around on. But you know what I mean? Like, I want to see Alberta have a military that can actually defend our land and that can contribute meaningfully to all of our allies, you know? Like, wouldn't it be nice? And we could do that. And so I would definitely be in favor of, this is based off of what we currently, our share of the current budget, federal budget. So, you know, this number might grow to like 10. Okay, initial setup costs, right? Capital investments, I guess we need to buy some bases. And by the way, a lot of the federal bases, right? They're federal. They have a huge environmental cost, right, to clean them up. And so this is part of our trade negotiation with Canada in the future, if we want to leave, is say, hey, we want that land, but you have this environmental liability. You got to pay billions and billions to clean it all up. Like, if you go to any one of these bases, there's unexploded munitions everywhere. And so we can't just turn that into farmland or abandon it. It needs to be reclaimed or reused. And so, like, we want to have a military base there and say to the federal government, like, okay, give that to us and we'll just write off your environmental liability. But I digress. Pension support, education, transition support for Canadian Armed Forces, military who transfer to the Alberta military. Like, I like that idea. You know, people who are in the Canadian military transfer to the Alberta military. You know, we'll actually have hardware, like equipment that you can use that you'll be proud of. Like, I know many soldiers, and quote me if I'm wrong here, guys. Many people in our army, they don't even have modern guns. Like, they're using the Browning high power. It's a handgun from like 1980. Right? You shoot your bullet, it goes through the paper sideways. Right? Like, what do we got for a military? You know, hats off to our soldiers. They're brave fighting people, yeah. But like, we're not taking care of them. We're not providing for them. So I want to like buy like the latest and greatest military hardware, completely integrate with the United States so that we can just like help as much as we can. And our allies in Europe, like, man, we could have something to really be proud of. My whole life, I've just heard that the Canadian military is a joke. You know, could we even put together a fighting force right now? If we were seriously at war, could we even do anything about it? I digress again. So I think this number could be a lot bigger. International relations, $0.5 to $1 billion, okay? So I guess we're going to need to build some embassies. Yeah, I would like to see Alberta immediately build embassies in the major countries, right, that we want to trade with. So the United States gets like 3 embassies or 5 embassies. Okay. You know, of course, China and Japan and maybe the Philippines and like Europe, you know, like France and Germany and the UK. So, you know, and Israel and probably India and Brazil. I don't know, probably South Africa too. Like, do we need an embassy in South Africa? Like, I don't know, guys. Furthermore, it's already a standing agreement. If you've ever traveled anywhere, you know, when you go to a country that doesn't have a Canadian embassy, because there's lots of them, you'll see on your travel documents that you can contact the British embassy or the American embassy, because we have agreements with these countries. And for certain diplomatic services, those countries just treat us exactly like they treat their own people, or like very similarly, especially in times of emergency. So I imagine Alberta would probably do a lot more of that. Like, we don't need an embassy in every country. So tell me if $500 million to $1 billion seems reasonable. Like, I think, I mean, sure, who am I to say no? But federal health programs, okay, so what is this? Okay, so this is Indigenous and veteran health. Now, I don't know why we break Indigenous health down. Maybe enlighten me, guys. But veteran health, like, I was thinking about this, you know. Okay, so there's soldiers who fought for Canada, you know, in our military, and they got injured, and or, you know, they need health care, and the Canadian system, I think, is failing. That's all I hear about, is it's failing them. And so I want to definitely take care of our veterans, but at the same time, like, should we make a distinction between Albertans who were once in the Canadian Army and give them better benefits, and then not help other, like, I guess that's what we're saying here, isn't it? You know, because if we take over the veteran benefits, then there's going to be Alberta citizens who are, like, retired from the military, and we're going to take over that liability. So I'm in favor of that, and I want to actually provide good services, and not just made, you know, I want to provide actual services. So, but there again, I go with the credit card, right? You got the large chunk of money. Here's $45 billion. Let's throw money at it. At the same time, though, I don't want to just be like Trudeau and just be like, yeah, we don't have money for it. Sorry, guys. What a terrible thing, eh? Employment insurance. Okay, so that's something we could already take over right now, I'm pretty sure. And, like, this is based off of how many people are working. So if more people are working, contributing economically, they're going to be paying more into it. And so, okay, same thing with the pension. More people working, more people paying into it. We take that over. And like, another thing with the pension that I've heard is that Carney's diversifying it now. He's going to be using the actual capital that's in that fund to, like, invest in India and stuff. And it's like, well, how about we use that to invest here in Canada first? It's kind of a biased thing to do. You know, we don't need the best return on investment, although usually you would say we want the best return. If you're going to be investing the billions of dollars that are in a pension fund, you know, until you got to pay them out, that is, reinvest them here. And so I would hope that an Alberta pension fund would be heavily invested in Alberta schools and hospitals and roads, but then also, like, oil and gas infrastructure, and AI infrastructure, and like grants for businesses here in Alberta. Like, you don't really just want billions of dollars sitting in a bank account. You do want to invest that so that it grows over time. But at the same time, you don't want to just give it to a billionaire who already ran hedge funds and billion-dollar companies, and then just say, here's a risk-free chunk of money. You can do whatever you want with it to, like, make your buddies richer and enrich yourself. All right, so I'm a little bit concerned about the Canadian pension plan to know if we actually have the money sitting there. And then borders and customs. Okay, well, so presumably our share of this is all, like, at the U.S. border and, like, at the airports. But once we become independent, we're going to have borders north and south, and right on the north too as well. I really feel bad for the people in the Northwest Territory, because if you know how, like, the geography is, that once you cross in the Northwest Territory, that little chunk where is connected to Alberta, there's basically only one road that goes up there. And really those parts of the Northwest Territory should just become part of Alberta. Like, we should have, like, a little round hat at the top to include those communities, because Canada's not going to take care of them. And I wish there was a way to say we could bring them in, but the territories are federal. Anyway, that's a whole different thing. We're going to need to have borders and customs, and we're going to have to change this a lot. I think the borders into BC will be the biggest ones, but Saskatchewan is going to need borders too. And unless those guys immediately get on board with independence themselves, then we're going to have checkpoints that you're going to have to sign in to come into Alberta. Like, that's literally what a country means. We need good borders. Now I want Saskatchewan to be part of us eventually, but so there's that. Federal and policing, 0.74 to 0.76. So this is the RCMP. I guess that's our share. We could do this right now. We could have a provincial police force and completely kick the federal police out of here. The RCMP, I don't really know. Part of what I like about them is they hire people from everywhere around the country, and then they send them around different places. And so the argument is like, well, they don't really get embedded in the community to like get involved with all the criminals. Like, that's always the thing about police corruption, right? So if you have a police force that moves around a lot, then maybe it's less prone to corruption. But no, I think we should just have an Alberta police force. I think the police should be policing their own communities. And, we need an oversight. I would add to that. We need an oversight, a police force that just polices the police, equally armed. They can show up at the police station, and if there's corruption happening there, then they can take them out. Like, we need to have some checks and balances. I think then we can have a system that works. But I don't know. Is that a believable number? That's our share of because we're going to have to take over, like, international scale crimes like drug dealing and, extortion and arms dealing and stuff like that. So maybe we need and we're still going to want to integrate with Canada as well. So, like, we don't want to just cut them off and be like, here, we're done. Indigenous services, $4.2 to $5 billion. So, increase. They're factoring in an increase, which is interesting. Why would we factor in an increase? Is that just to be nice? Is that just to bring them over? I don't explain that to me. Other federal services, so federal courts, regulatory, Canada Post. Yeah, Canada Post can just go bye-bye. We don't need Canada Post. I resent Canada Post. I live in a neighborhood where somebody gets paid to walk to my door and put it in the box. Other parts in the place where I live, other regions, they have to go to a box and it's like on the street corner. But then, like, the only thing I ever get from Canada Post is spam mail and like government things that I got to do. Like, it's time to file your taxes. So why can't we farm that out to Amazon or to FedEx or to, UPS, these other private companies, and just like every 5 years, just have them compete on the contract to deliver our mail? Like, we don't need that whole thing. What's Nav Canada? I don't know what that is. I don't know everything, guys. Okay, so there's that. And that takes us to the end of expenses. So there's my 2 cents on everything, guys. Please leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. And thank you for watching this series. I'm going to continue reading through this document, so please stay tuned for part 3. Cheers.